Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy. In our fifth series, we've been focusing on the last 100 years of American democracy between 1924 and 2024. And I don't want to sound too biased, but if there is a decade that perhaps defines American democracy more than any other in the last 100 years, it's the 1960s. For some people, it represents the beginning of everything that is good and promising about American political, cultural life. For others, it represents something quite different. Our guest today, Yuval Levin, is a conservative, but a liberal conservative or a conservative liberal. So I'm guessing, Yuval, that you don't fit into either of those buckets of people who see the 1960s as the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning?
That's fair. I think the 1960s are interesting as the beginning of a process of liberalization in American life that has to be understood as, first of all, a reaction to what came before it, which was a period of intense cohesion and consolidation. 2 world wars, a depression, left American society really unusually cohesive and self-confident, confident of its elites, which Americans never are. And what you begin to see in the 1960s in American culture is a culture rebelling against conformity, demanding to be liberated from bigness in every part of life. You see it on the left and the right. We're used to thinking of the left that way, but if you look, for example, at the emerging American conservative movement at the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, it's intensely libertarian, which conservatives had not been until that time. It's pushing against constriction and conformity. And I think the thing to understand about the 1960s, the reason that they're so attractive and appealing to so many Americans in the 21st century in a variety of ways, I would say conservatives want to live in the culture of that time. Liberals want to experience the changes, the economy of that time. A lot of that had to do with a very consolidated society beginning to liberalize. So it had the benefits of consolidation. Families were strong, church attendance was strong, confidence in institutions was strong, and yet it also had the beginnings of liberalization. The civil rights movement, the push for increased immigration, the push against the various ways in which American society was too rigid. To have both of those things at the same time, the benefits of cohesion and the thrill of liberalization is very unusual. It's inherently unsustainable. Liberalization was going to have its effects. But I think people think back to the 60s as a time when America could enjoy both. So Americans talk about how strong family and church were. Conservatives talk about how strong family and church were. Progressives talk about how liberalization began. And they're both right. It's just that the combination couldn't possibly last. I think that's the magic of the 60s for people.
You mentioned American elites being strong in the 50s. Is that the reason why now when we look back, there's a degree of nostalgia for the consensus and the civility in American political life?
Nostalgia is a very important word in thinking about the 50s and 60s. I think the biggest reason for nostalgia is actually that the generation that was young in the early 1960s is still extraordinarily dominant in American life. What they miss is just their youth. I miss my youth too. That was in the 1980s. But they think about America through the lens of their own life cycle. I can quickly walk you through it. Think about an American born in 1946, the peak year of the baby boom. Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Donald Trump were all born in 1946, within 4 weeks of each other, in the summer of 46. That person experienced the 50s as a child, thinks of it as simple, as everything was straightforward, families were great, life was easy. Thinks of the 60s as a teenager. It was exciting, the music was great, everything was open before them. Then they think of the 70s and 80s through the eyes of someone maturing into adulthood. It's much more complicated. There's a kind of anxiety in the 70s. By the middle of the 80s, you're in your 40s, you're thinking about the mortgage more than about how to change the world. The 90s are great. That's when you're in charge. The world is yours. But in the 21st century, you're a little disoriented. You're not sure how to make sense of this new world. You're worried about whether your kids will have the world you had. That's what life looks like if you were born in 1946. The trouble for us is that's what life looks like to Americans of all ages now, because we all think about our recent history through the eyes of the baby boomers, through the eyes of people born in that time. We've had tremendous trouble breaking out of that nostalgia. There's a lot wrong with that nostalgia. American politics in the 1950s were not simple, were not easy, were not cordial. These are the times when you have sheriffs, sicking dogs on protesters in Alabama. America was very divided. There was a level of political violence in the 1960s that we're not even approaching in this period that we think is so divisive and dangerous. There were assassinations, there were political bombings, the country was extremely divided. But we think of that time through the lens of people who were young in that time, and we're not realistic about what the 50s and 60s really were. I think that nostalgia has had a tremendous effect on American politics, on the left and the right, and we're only now beginning to break through it. I'll say we're still thinking through the lens of people who were born in the 1940s. Our president was born in the 40s. The person running against him were born in the 40s. That's crazy. These people are 80 years old, and they're still dominating our politics. What it means now to think through the lens of an 80-year-old is that we don't think about the future in American political life. We're running up to an election now when exactly no one is talking about the future. That's a failure of our politics that I think has a lot to do with that nostalgia.
It's ironic that the 60s are so much bound up with youth, but you're arguing that the powerful generation, the political elites, are not just hoarding wealth in America today, but they're hoarding ideas, ideology.
Yeah, and I would say position, right? I mean, they still get to define how we think about ourselves. And if you think about Bill Clinton entering our politics as a youthful force in the 1990s, Donald Trump now exemplifying a kind of decrepit 80-year-old, those men are exactly the same age, right? They were born, Clinton in August of 46, Trump in June of 46. But their generation has been in power that entire time, a 30-year period. It's very unusual. And the fact that there's not an obvious kind of middle generation behind them, we've got youth in America, we've got these very old leaders in America. There's a missing middle that I think has a lot to do with the dysfunction of our politics now.
I take your point on Clinton and Trump, of course. But Donald Trump never seems as if he was young. He was never a rebel, whereas Bill Clinton seemed to epitomize the rebellion, for better or worse, of the 1960s.
I would say the 60s were not just a rebellion. The thing that's hard to remember about 1968, the great year of rebellion, that was the year that Richard Nixon was elected president. And Richard Nixon got a lot of young voters in that year. There was definitely a youthful reaction against the kind of hippie rebel culture that we now think of as defining the 1960s. Donald Trump exemplifies that. He was in a military school in those days. He saw himself as an alternative to these kind of hapless hippies. And there were a lot of people of his generation who were like it. George W. Bush was like that too. There was definitely a right in the youth culture of American life in that time. Our nostalgia kind of blinds us to it, but I think Trump and Clinton both represent something of that moment.
What about family relations, Yuval, in your generational analysis? Trump, of course, seems to have spent his life trying to please his father even after his father died. Clearly his father was a bully. Clinton never really had a father. George Bush as well has a more congenial relationship with his father, a better relationship. Was it the 60s in the way convention has suggested, a generational revolt against parents?
It's an interesting question. I certainly think those three men, although it's probably true of a lot of people who succeed in politics, they're kind of obsessed with proving to their parents that they can do it.
Or fathers, Yuval. You don't hear a lot about mothers.
It's true. George W. Bush, too. I mean, he had a great relationship with his father, but look, he spent his entire life trying to show that he could do what his father did. I do think there's a profound generational character to the way in which Americans have thought about the last 70 years, that 60s generation thought of itself as a generation in a very unusual degree. And you begin to get the language of generation politics in the 1960s. It was, for one thing, a huge generation. I mean, the baby boom really was twice as large as its parents' generation, which is very unusual in any society, and thought of itself in a kind of cohesive way. And since then, we've continued to do that. We've named every generation since, even those that are much smaller and sort of less well defined. And yeah, we think about our society now in generational terms in a pretty interesting way.
The 20s was a period of enormous energy, youthful exuberance after the First World War. But was the 60s the first period in American history where youth was fetishized and old age was critiqued implicitly?
I do think that there is a way in which the fact that those Americans were born after the Second World War, after a moment when it seemed like the entire world was falling apart, and suddenly America not only won, but dominated the world in a way that no society, maybe since Rome, had dominated the world. For a brief time, the United States, because it had won the war, but the war had never come to our shores, all of our economic competitors were just decimated. And the United States stood atop this world as an unmatched giant in a very unusual way. I think it created a moment of exuberance and excitement. And that generation that was born into that moment certainly was understood as holding an unusual kind of promise by its own parents. I mean, I think that there was a liberationist tendency in the parenting of the 1940s and 50s that certainly expressed itself in the attitudes of those children. I think a lot of this had to do with the psychology of the war, which in the United States was just very different from Europe. A lot of European societies, even the UK, came out of the war basically in an economic depression and dealt with a period of great constriction and difficulty in the 1950s. The United States came out of the war in a massive boom, unmatched in our history, maybe in anyone's history. And it created a moment of liberation that, in retrospect, you can understand in light of the war.
Was there something particularly, Yuval, dishonest about the 1950s? Every age, of course, is dishonest. There's always mythologies. But the truth about Black America was ignored in the 50s. The truth about women, the truth about mental illness, the truth about homosexuality. Did this in itself create a kind of potential volcano for the 60s?
Yeah. It's interesting. I think we think of the 50s that way because of the 60s. So those truths had been denied forever. The fact is, Americans had been in denial about race since the Civil War, and obviously in a lot of ways before that. The roles of women had not been allowed to become a public issue until the late 50s, early 60s. But because that happened in the 60s, as a rebellion against the 50s, I think we think of the 50s as a much more conservative time than they necessarily were. The 50s were a time when that liberation began, right? The 60s didn't come out of nowhere. You begin to see a kind of cultural liberation movement in the wake of World War II. And we attribute the rigidity of all of the history of the West to the 1950s now, because the 60s rebels were rebelling against the 50s. And we live with a caricature of that time. It's unavoidable, right? We always caricature the times we ourselves live in. And there's always a certain amount of hypocrisy in how we understand our society. But I think we think of the 50s in terms of hypocrisy to a greater degree than they really deserve. That was the beginning of the revolution. Everything that happened in the 60s had its seeds and its origins in the 1950s. Americans came out of the war. You can see this in the literature of the 1950s, which already was a scream against constriction and conformity.
The gray flannel man.
Exactly, against the gray flannel man. You see it in James Dean, the rebel without a cause. That's in the 50s, not in the 60s. So I think we start to see it then. Obviously, the seeds of the civil rights movement, a lot of the great Martin Luther King concepts and ideas, he's developing those in sermons in the 1950s. So that was really a period of a beginning of what came to happen in the 60s, but obviously we understand it in contrast with it.
Today, all those problems, everyone blames the internet. In the 50s, of course, it was radio, then television,
Yeah.
and the movies. How central was media in all this?
Well, I do think it was central. It's easy, as you say, to kind of blame media for everything. You know, our communications tools are tools. We use them in a particular way. So when we see how we use them, we should ask why we're choosing to do this. I think a lot of the complaints about the internet now, the question I have is, we're given the internet. Why are we using it like this? That's not really a question about the internet. I do think, though, that there's something about the mass media of the early 20th century, all the way through the 1960s and 70s, that contributed immensely to the cohesion of American life in that period. You have a situation where Americans have common experiences to a very unusual degree. We think that always happened before the fragmentation of the 80s and 90s, but it really didn't. Americans had very little communication with each other across a vast continent until the telephone, the radio, the television, cinema just gave us a common culture in a very unusual way, so that you did have people by the 1950s and 60s, an entire generation experiencing the same music, the same movies. There were only 3 television stations, so everybody was watching one of 3 things every night. You could go to work and talk to people about what they did last night, and everybody did the same thing. That's not the norm. Again, I think because so many Americans now grew up in that kind of world, they think, well, that's what life is, and now that's breaking apart. I think American life now, in a lot of ways, is much more like it was in the 19th century than we tend to imagine. It was that mid-20th century moment that was so unusual, and it created a very unusual American culture.
Robert Putnam, Mr. Bowling Alone, was on the show a couple of years ago. Of course, his argument, his narrative of history is it works in cycles from a communitarian to an alienated, isolated, liberal world. Are you suggesting that that the Putnam narrative is probably wrong, that the 60s is exceptional?
I think there's certainly truth to his basic narrative that life in the United States has been swinging between communitarianism and individualism from the beginning. And very often, each is a reaction against the excesses of the other. We live in a moment now where we really feel the excesses of individualism. People talk about isolation and loneliness, and we're entering a period where solidarity is going to be very important in our public life. And that's because we pushed so far against the cohesion and conformity of the 50s and 60s. But I do think that that moment of the middle of the 20th century was very unusual in this regard. The degree of cohesion and conformity, the absence of economic inequality for a short period in American life, the absence of immigration and cultural diversity, which we give too little credit to. The United States basically stopped allowing large numbers of immigrants in the 1920s until the middle of the 60s. The 1970 census had the fewest proportion, the smallest proportion of residents born abroad in the United States in the entire history of our country. So that we had a far less cultural diversity in the 1950s and 60s than we had in the 1850s and 60s, let alone than we have today. I think that moment was very unusual, very odd in ways that continue to matter.
A lot of people treat the 60s as this eruption of rebellion against conformity, but when one looks at the newsreels, the movies, sometimes even reads the books, there seems to be a great deal of conformity, a conformity in rebellion itself.
Yes.
I'm guessing as a relatively conservative liberal, you would agree on.
Yes, I think that's right. And the 60s in a lot of ways were very conformist. And again, because we had such strong forces creating mass culture, conformity really was the order of the day. I always think, in thinking about the 1960s, of that moment in Monty Python's Life of Brian. There's a big crowd, and they're all screaming, "We're all individuals." And there's this one guy in the middle who says, "I'm not." That guy's the conservative in the 1950s and 60s. And all the individualists are individualists together. There was definitely a culture of conformity, the theme of which was the fight against conformity. It's just an irony of that moment.
But what do you make of the new right in the 60s? Obviously of William Buckley, Phyllis Schlafly, Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan. Is that the most important political narrative of the 60s in retrospect in terms of its legacy?
It's hard to say. There were two very important political narratives in the 60s. One was the emergence of a genuinely leftist left in America, where you really do begin to see a kind of cultural progressivism that had at least been suppressed for a long time. The other is the emergence of a new conservatism. The first time you really see a political movement calling itself conservative in American political life is, in a big way, is in the 1950s and into the 60s. There'd always been a right since the beginning, in some ways, in America. But conservatives, British conservatives were calling themselves that in the 1830s. You never have that word in American political life until after World War II. In some ways, it's a reaction to conformism, too. It's a reaction to political collectivism, to the New Deal, to the role of government coming out of the Second World War. And so that new right is libertarian in an unusual way. Libertarianism is not always on the right. It's very often a movement of the left. But in the 1950s and 60s, the push against conformity and against collectivism meant that the American right became very friendly to capitalism, became very friendly to a certain kind of individualism. It is, in a sense, an unusual right. You see the same thing throughout the English-speaking world in that post-war period. And I think it was enormously important. The 60s end with Richard Nixon in office. And Nixon was not a Buckleyite. He was not a Goldwater conservative. But he began to embody that reaction against the new role of government and a reaction against the radicalism of the American left in a way that became very important. We think about Nixon now through the lens of Watergate, but Nixon was extremely popular. He won re-election in 1972 with 49 states. All but Minnesota voted for him. It's very hard for us now to remember that. But that conservative reaction against the excesses of the left was hugely important at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s.
I mean, for those who are kind to Richard Nixon, they would argue he was politically prescient in understanding that the white working class was up for grabs, yes, that the new left had alienated that old white working class, and with the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, the Democrats lost the sense of their moral or political obligation to that, yes, class. That's the generous reading of Nixon. The less generous one is he appropriated essentially the historic racism, particularly of the American South, and turned American politics on its head and used his Southern strategy to transform the Republican Party into a white racist party. Of those two narratives, what do you think is truer about
Well,
Nixon?
I think the first one is more true, but there's certainly some truth to both. Nixon understood, first of all, what Nixon really understood was that the South was in play, which was big news. The South had belonged to the Democrats since the Civil War. And in American politics, which is unavoidably a regional politics, especially our presidential elections because of the Electoral College, the idea that a Republican could win Georgia, that a Republican could win Mississippi, was unimaginable until the 1960s for 100 years. And Nixon saw an enormous opportunity there. Some of that opportunity was certainly just a working class white political opportunity, and that was true in the North too, so that Nixon began to win constituencies that had belonged to the Democrats for a long time. The kind of ethnic minorities, ethnic Catholics, the Irish, Polish, and other immigrants came into political play in a way that had not happened since they had arrived in America. Nixon saw these opportunities. He was not himself a racist. Nixon had supported the civil rights movement. He'd supported Martin Luther King.
He was, in fact, very close to Jackie Robinson, although I think right. Robinson wasn't happy with some of his later decisions.
But look, Nixon understood that part of what it meant for Republicans to dominate white voters in the South was, at the very least, putting up with an awful lot of racism in the politics of the party. And there's no doubt that that happened. So I think both these stories have some truth to them. I do think that the first story, the story of working class opportunities, is what spoke to him more and spoke to Republicans more. But both of these things happened. There's no way around that.
Earlier, Yuval, you mentioned people critiquing elites, seeing through elites. Of course, that was most manifested with the catastrophe in Vietnam and the
yes.
critique of the American foreign policy establishment. We've done a show on that. How did that shape the 60s? Is it the critical background to making sense of the crisis of the American elites, the coastal elites, certainly the foreign policy liberal elites in the 60s?
Certainly, the foreign policy liberal elites. I think that there are a number of essential transformations that happened in the 1960s in American political life. The emergence of a mass youth movement that was very culturally liberal, as we've talked about, the re-emergence of immigration, which began again in 1965, and the disaster of the Vietnam War, which more than anything undermined people's confidence and trust in American leaders. I think we have to understand the United States came out of the Second World War with tremendous confidence in its elites. I would say, in retrospect, way too much confidence in its elites. A sense that the people up there know what they're doing. And American political life in the decade that followed the war was really a process of negotiation among elites. Big business, big labor, big government working together to address big problems. And the confidence that Americans of all kinds had in these elites is really astonishing. In the scope of American history, mistrust in elites is much more common than trust in elites. Our politics is defined by populism from the beginning. But we had this period, this window of just tremendous trust. The fact that what's happened since is a return to the American norm matters less than we might imagine, because we lived through that period of the 50s and 60s, so that this return to normal has felt like a collapse of trust. And we have lived through a collapse of trust in elites that has had everything to do with the subsequent development of American political life. And I would say the emergence of a conservatism that doesn't trust elites may be the most interesting and important dynamic in contemporary America. Conservatives generally are the defenders of the institutions, the defenders of various kinds of elites. Today's conservatives are the populists, and that's created a politics that no one quite knows what to do with. It's very much a product of what began in the 60s.
But wasn't that conservative populism in existence in the 30s, and the hatred of FDR, who of course was the elite? And
Yeah.
he, perhaps more than anyone else, can be, I don't know if it's blamed or credited with the trust that Americans had. And of course he was the most, if not patriarchal, certainly aristocratic figure in American history.
I think that's right, but there's an interesting dynamic to see there that might be a little hard for us to see now. FDR was seen as a kind of traitor to his class. He was rejected by people on the right who understood themselves to be the proper elites. You can think about American politics, first of all, along an axis of left and right, which is very important and has been from the beginning for us. But secondly, along an axis of what I would call insider and outsider. Who are the people who think they rightly own the institutions and see everybody else as not belonging there? And who are the people who think they're banging on the windows, they're on the outside, they don't trust the leaders, they don't trust the elites? For a long time in American life, the right understood itself as the inside party. Even when it was losing elections, it tended to think, these are our institutions, this belongs to us, these people don't belong here. And the attitude toward the left was that kind of attitude. We've lived through, since about the 1990s, a reversal between left and right in terms of who thinks they're the inside and who thinks they're the outside. I'll give you an example. In a close election, the losing party always comes up with some story about how it didn't really happen. The losing inside party in a close election will say something like, the Russians stole the election. That's what the right would have said for most of my lifetime. That's what the left says now. The losing outside party says something like, the elites who run the corporations and the elites who run the government denied the voice of the people, right? That's a Noam Chomsky leftist argument from when I was young. That's now how the right talks in America. The left and right have switched sides, and the right is now the outside party. I think that process did begin in the 1960s and 70s, but it's really seen itself through today. And understanding that is really crucial to understanding American political life, because a politics where the progressives, the political radicals, are the insiders who run Harvard, and the conservatives are the outsiders who are banging on the window and complaining about corporations, that's a new reality that neither of our parties has really wrapped its head around. And they're both having trouble figuring out who their voters are and what they're supposed to say for that reason.
Does that suggest, Yuval, that words like left and right, liberal and conservative, are actually worse than useless? They're actually confusing, and that we need new language to describe these new movements?
So I think left and right are still very useful. Left and right, you know, in the Anglosphere, since really the end of the 18th century, left and right have described two ways of thinking about political and social change. The party of the left thinks about political life as a contest between oppressor and oppressed. Sometimes that's economic, like Marxism. Sometimes that's cultural, as we find today, or ethnic or racial. But politics is the strong and the weak, and you got to side with the weak or else you're unjust. And the right thinks about politics in terms of order and disorder, civilization and barbarism. I think those categories still matter a lot. And the American left today still very much thinks about politics in terms of oppressor oppressed. The right, listen to Donald Trump for 5 minutes, still very much thinks in terms of civilization and barbarism, home and the invader. That's still very much the language of the right. So I think left and right still matter a lot. But we are in a moment, it seems to me, where insider-outsider matters more than usual. And where what really defines this time is that it is a populist moment. And we're struggling to think about how to make sense of a time when really no one wants to be the insider. That's an unusual thing. You find members of Congress now standing in front of cameras saying, you wouldn't believe what happens here, and talking about the elites and this and that. And I think, who's the elites if not you? You know, Donald Trump spent 4 years that way, talking about and at the government while he was president of the United States. That is a kind of confusion that I think does suggest that we need some new terms, some new concepts. I think left and right still has a place in that vocabulary, but we're having trouble understanding our politics. There's no doubt about it. Both parties are having trouble understanding their own electorate.
Yuval, let's go back to the 60s. We've talked about Vietnam. We've talked about the transformation of the political parties, the new role of the white working class, the crisis of the elites. In that sense, all of America appears or sounds tarnished in the 60s. The one thing that remains, seems to me at least, untarnished is the civil rights movement and the achievements of civil rights. It's odd now looking back that all these things existed in parallel. It's easy, of course, to connect the narrative of civil rights to everything else that was happening in the 60s. But is it also separate?
I do think it's separate, and I think that in some ways the changing party dynamics that we've started talking about a little had a lot to do with that. The 1960s were the time when black voters and the language of civil rights began to switch from being Republicans to being Democrats. And in that period, in that moment, there was a genuine bipartisanship about civil rights. Republicans had been the party of civil rights, remember, since Abraham Lincoln started the party in the 1850s. And black voters were Republican voters until the 1950s. There was still,
even with FDR?
Even with FDR, quite a lot of black voters remained, because FDR, remember, FDR's coalition was the white Southerners and northern city dwellers. There were certainly some black voters in that coalition, but those white Southerners were very racist white Southerners and wanted nothing to do with civil rights. It was much easier for Republicans to embrace the civil rights movement. And look, in the 1950s, Martin Luther King is a Republican. And he had a lot of trouble deciding who to support in the 1960 election. By the end of the 60s, that's not true anymore. But in the course of the 1960s, if you look at the voting tallies for the two great civil rights bills of the 60s, the Civil Rights Bill of 64, the Voting Rights Bill of 65, those were very bipartisan measures. They didn't pass by large margins because there were a lot of Southern Democrats voting against them. There were a lot of Northern Republicans voting for them. And the leaders of the Democratic and Republican Party both supported those bills. Until Barry Goldwater becomes the Republican leader, he had voted against the Civil Rights Act of 64. So that transformation, I think, made civil rights a very unusual issue in the 1960s. The other divisive issues were not really like that. There was still a lot of partisanship in that time. But civil rights, because it was going through that transition, really was, it crossed party lines in an unusual way and was a very different issue than the others.
It still has a very American, traditionally, perhaps conservatively American narrative. The amount of times that the MLK quote about the arc of justice, the arc of history bending towards justice, I mean, it's obviously something said by King, but
Yeah.
it could have been something suggested by one of the American founders. Did American history, in an odd way, with civil rights begin in the 60s again?
Yeah, I think there was a very self-conscious and intentional and smart decision by the leaders of the civil rights movement to embrace the American tradition rather than rejecting it, to tell white America, this is what the Declaration of Independence means, rather
reminding Americans of what being America
that's right.
meant.
You know, Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech in front of a statue of Abraham Lincoln. And part of the message there was really speaking to conservatives, speaking to white Americans in general, and telling them this is what your tradition is about, rather than telling them your tradition is unjust and you should throw it away, which would not have succeeded. They said, we're here to actually help you understand what the Declaration of Independence means. Now, I think they were helped by the fact that that actually is what it means. I mean, it actually says all men are created equal. You don't have to work too hard to see that that was not being, that was not how a lot of America was living. And so they had a very strong case to make. But the fact that they made it in those relatively traditionalist terms, I think, had a lot to do with why it could have the kind of appeal it did. They weren't calling for a revolution. They were calling for a kind of working out of the logic of American life, and that made a big difference.
And of course, the other astonishing feature of the 1960s was the level of political violence.
Yeah.
The Kennedys were both assassinated, ML came, Malcolm X. What's been the legacy of that? What does that tell us about the last 60 years of American democracy?
It's actually amazing to me how thoroughly we Americans have worked to forget that side of the 60s and early 70s. We talk now about division, and we say it's unprecedented or more divided than ever. In the summer of 1968, after the assassination of Martin Luther King, 1 in 4 buildings in the city of Washington, where we are now, was burned down in riots. That is a level of political violence that we cannot imagine now. Our divisions now look like people saying things about other people on the internet. What you saw in the 1960s and 70s was an amazing level of political violence, really unprecedented since the middle of the 19th century in America. And the question of what it's meant is a very interesting question. Americans just put it behind them, and nobody talks about it now. I don't think a lot of Americans live with the memory of the summer of '68 or of the bombings of the early '70s. And there was a kind of turning away from it by the middle of the '70s. Even Jimmy Carter, let alone Ronald Reagan, tried to talk to America as though that had never happened. And maybe they were right. Maybe there was not a way to really face up to that. But it does mean that we haven't really digested that reality, and that we, even now, we're not afraid enough of political violence because we don't live with that memory. And I think it leaves us vulnerable to people acting on their kind of internet animosities in ways that we saw, for example, on January 6th of 2021, but that I think we're liable to see from both left and right if we have another close election, because we don't have those cautionary lessons in mind. We don't really remember that side of the 60s.
It's interesting you bring up Reagan. Even when he was, even after the assassination attempt, he seemed to almost forget it in making his remarks. He behaved as if it was on a Hollywood set. Many people have accused Reagan of broader political or cultural amnesia. How does he fit into this narrative? Is he the next chapter, or is he again an aberration for you as a liberal conservative?
Yeah. Well, Reagan's in some ways certainly an aberration. He was just such an unusual figure. But I do think that Reagan led America out of the darker sides of the 60s and 70s, allowed for a kind of renewal of self-confidence and patriotism that was very important. I would say, he was the person who could take the baby boomers from youthful rebellion to comfortable middle age. And that's exactly what he did. He brought them to a place where they could afford a mortgage. He helped the American economy become a middle-class economy. And he also talked about America in ways that were just much more comfortable for middle-aged baby boomers than the kind of radicalism of their own youth. And so I think that had a lot to do with his popularity. He was a figure from before the 1960s. I mean, there's no way around it. He tried to ignore the 60s. He talked about America in terms that that the young of the 60s had tried to reject, and it worked. I mean, look, he created a kind of narrative that I think was dominant. Look, Reagan also won re-election with 49 states, like Nixon did. He was, by the middle of his presidency, extremely popular. And I think he transformed the right and the left. I mean, the left that followed, the left of Bill Clinton, was very much a post-Reagan left and not a pre-Reagan left.
What about the darker legacy, the politics of the left, in terms of Reagan, would suggest that he was the founding neoliberal president, that he financed or didn't finance the decimation of the public space, enabled massive tax cuts, which created the conditions for the dramatic inequality, economic, cultural, political, of the 21st century. Is that legacy for you, even as a conservative, troubling?
Some of it is troubling. I don't think of neoliberalism, what's come to be called neoliberalism, as all that dark. I think it's brought prosperity to more people in more places than any other idea in the history of the human race. So that, broadly speaking, I think capitalism is one of the best ideas human beings have ever had. But certainly Ronald Reagan stood for that notion, and Ronald Reagan, I would say, he followed through on the individualism that emerges from the 1960s. And that individualism, followed through, does have dark sides. It does lead, I think, to a dissolution of some social institutions. It does lead to a narrowing of public spaces in favor of private spaces. There's good in that. It is liberating, it is empowering, and it created enormous prosperity. But there's bad in that too, and we're seeing some of that now. It creates isolation and loneliness. It creates a greater difficulty for Americans in speaking of our country as ours, in saying we and us when we talk about America. That's become more difficult since the 1980s. I think the irony of our history, of any nation's history, is that our strengths are always the other side of the coin of our weaknesses. And when we talk about our problems, we're talking about the consequences and implications of some of our strengths. Every problem is a former solution. And the problems we have now emerged from the solution to the kind of conformity and rigidity of America in the middle of the 20th century. They are problems now, and so they call, I think, for a politics of solidarity that would not be Ronald Reagan's politics. In some ways, the strange thing is how much the American right still does cling to Ronald Reagan. Reagan did not run for president talking about Dwight Eisenhower, who had been president 30 years before him. A lot of Republicans today still talk about Ronald Reagan. His presidency began 44 years ago. That's a long time ago. And the idea that he's still dominant, I think, is an indication that we haven't had another generation of transformative leaders since that time. And that points to a vacuum more than to the strength of Ronald Reagan.
Let's end with your analysis of the current situation. You began with observations about the baby boomer generation, which is a hoarded power, political and economic and cultural, over the last 60 years. Is that the problem now in the 2020s, in the 2024 election later this year? Two 80-year-old men who both appear to be profoundly out of touch with America will be running, more and more dissatisfaction. Yeah. Is that the opportunity or the crisis?
Well, I think it is the end of a phase. An election where two 80-year-olds are running against each other is not the beginning of something new and exciting. It is the end of a phase in American political life, a long phase. And I think the important thing to see about the last portion of this phase of our politics, really the 21st century in American politics, is that it's been a period of deadlock, of 50-50 elections over and over and over. We haven't actually had a time like that before in America. You look in on American politics at any time, and you would find a majority party holding a complicated coalition together, and a minority party struggling to build its own coalition instead. We've now had 30 years of two minority parties. They only define themselves against one another. Neither of them is very good at coalition building, which is the work of political parties. I think the next phase of our politics begins when one of them sees a breakthrough opportunity to actually win an election, which no one has actually done since the middle of the 1990s. To win with 60% of the vote, which is perfectly imaginable. I think, frankly, that if either party just ran a 55-year-old governor of any state in this election, it would probably win 60% of the vote. There's a huge opportunity here, but it's going to take political talent that we have not yet seen emerge. And so I think this moment that we're living in, this election, is going to be understood in the long run of history as the end of something. And what is it that's beginning is up to this generation of American politicians. And I will tell you that my sense is they have no idea. It's going to take a political talent with a connection to American culture and American life that we haven't yet seen emerge. That person is going to emerge quickly and suddenly, in my estimation, because there's such a huge opening here that someone is going to fill the vacuum. That's how I feel in this moment.
But is that how American history really works, Yuval? Finally. I mean, the last great political talent was Barack Obama. Everyone talked about his presidency as a new dawn, didn't seem to change anything. Don't we need more than simply some clever, sexy young politician?
We do. I think we need a political coalition, a movement. And Obama, at the end of the day, as he ran in 2008, was not well connected to the dynamics of American political life. I don't think he was. I thought he was that kind of talent too at that time. I don't think he was. I think the last great political talent we saw was probably Bill Clinton, who did, in a way, create a new moment. Before that, we saw Ronald Reagan. I think you can point to other individuals that emerged out of nowhere. Franklin Roosevelt is one of them. But yes, it would take a bubbling up. It would take something to build on. And I think it would take a kind of political imagination. I will say one more thing. It would also take a talent for coalition building, which no one has right now. American politics is very, very bad at coalition building at this moment. It tends to hunt heretics rather than seek converts. And until that changes, I think it's going to be very hard to break out of this moment.
Well, how to fix democracy in the business of coalition building. Yuval Levin, thank you so much for appearing on our show.
Thanks very much.